who student at the School of Public Policy, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And over the last 11 weeks, she has been working with our team, particularly Jinha, my colleague, and I, who are leading on this TA, looking at how women are differentially impacted by heat stress and how to build resilience to heat stress. So with that, I will hand it over to Labisha to take us through her presentation. And at the end of her presentation, we'll also have some time for questions and answers. So over to you, Labisha. And yes, and if you can save your questions to the end of the session, please, that would be great. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Labisha. Thank you so much for showing up. I know it's a very busy morning for everybody at the ADB. I'm just going to go right into it. So I came into ADB about 10 weeks ago. More people are joining. That's nice. And I was tasked to do essentially two things. The first, map global heat-related interventions and look at their gender considerations. And second, look at solutions for crafting gender-responsive plans, gender-responsive solutions. So I'm just going to break that down into the agenda for the day. I'm going to begin by explaining why we should be focusing on heat and then why we should be focusing on gender in heat. Then I'm going to be talking about the actual exercise, so the heat-related interventions and how gendered they were. I'm going to explain my methodology for doing that. And then I'm going to do a deep dive in something called heat action plans. Then we will move on to looking at recommendations for the ADB when it comes to heat work. First of all, why pay attention to heat? I think a lot of us working in climate change already understand this, but just to sort of justify it a bit more, there's some statistic that I read from the UN Thailand report that 486,000 people died in Asia as a result of extreme heat between the years of 2000 and 2019. Another statistic is 21,000 hectares of rice crops have been destroyed in Bangladesh as a result of extreme heat alone in 2021. But I wanted to show this one graph that looks at the relationship between heat and labor productivity. So this is a 2023 paper that looks at annual hours reduced due to extreme heat in certain megacities in South Asia. And we're looking at 4 cities here. And if you look at the green squiggly line above, that's basically about workers who are engaged in heavy workload. So you're looking at workers that work in construction, they're working in brick factories, they're doing a lot of manual labor. And we can see that, for example, in New Delhi and Dhaka, up to 2,000 hours are being lost annually due to extreme heat. What does this mean? It means that they are losing wages. It means that eventually national economies are going to be impacted. And in fact, the paper goes on to say that if there is a 2-degree rise in global temperatures, India could lose up to 10% of its GDP. And that's a pretty shocking statistic if you think about it. Now, secondly, I want to talk about why mention heat or why mention gender when we're talking about heat. And I really like this quote that I came across when I was doing my research, which basically talks of heat as thermal violence that is enacted on those who are differently positioned in terms of class, race, religion, ethnicity, and gender. I think it really positions the fact that heat does not impact everybody the same way. And particularly, heat has a disproportionate impact on women. So I'm going to talk about a number of things of why and how this happens. First of all, going back to labor conditions and labor economy, a lot of us working at the ADB obviously know that women in developing economies are concentrated in the informal workforce. So they're working as tenant farmers on small farms, they're working as domestic laborers in a lot of these countries. This means that they are outside the ambit of formal work protections. Nobody's going to give them cooling solutions. And in fact, this report, very aptly named The Chilling Effect, talks about how women have 60% less access to cooling than men. Secondly, women are exposed to greater vulnerability during and after disasters. I'm going to quote the IUCN disaster and gender statistic here that says that women, boys, and girls have a 14 times higher chance of dying during a disaster. I mean, that's a pretty terrible thing to think about. Another thing that the statistic mentions is, for example, in countries like Sri Lanka, when there was a tsunami in the early 2000s, men were able to survive more simply because they could swim. This is pointing to a really sad statistic of the fact that during limited coping abilities of women in a lot of these countries, they are much more vulnerable to disasters. Secondly, a lot of times after disasters, the assets that are sold to keep the family afloat are that of women. So gold is sold, gold that is owned by the women. Small plots of farms are sold, usually that is owned by the women as well. So this, of course, increases their vulnerability. Thirdly, there are biological and physiological differences between men and women that make them more vulnerable. For example, it's been shown by a number of studies that women tend to have higher inner core temperatures. They tend to sweat less, which means they dissipate heat less, and then this increases their vulnerability when they're pregnant. So this means that they have higher maternal core temperatures, especially when you're working and you're pregnant, for example, in farms or in factories, and this increases the chances of stillbirths and miscarriages. And this has been shown by a study on 800 pregnant women in India. Again, there is increasing burden on women when there is more heat. People fall ill, and a lot of this burden of care intends to fall on the women again. Finally, and probably very unfortunately, there is research now coming on that increased heat waves causes increased aggression and an increase in domestic partner violence. So after all of this very depressing statistic, I'm going into explaining what I actually did with the exercise. So I looked at existing heat interventions and I came up with like a methodology of grouping them. So when I went into the exercise, first of all, it was a vast amount of data. I didn't exactly know how to deal with it. And so eventually a kind of picture started emerging when I started building a database on Excel. I started identifying certain kinds of entry points that were more common than others. And then that had certain kinds of examples linked to it. And then broadly looking, it could be categorized into three things. So for the first one, we're looking at policy level entry points. So that would be beginning with your international protocols and your agreements. I don't think I need to explain a lot of this to this crowd, but of course we have the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Amendment, etc. The one that's interesting here is, of course, the Paris Agreement, because it enables countries to create certain kind of gender responsive climate change action plans, which mentions heat and gender. And that is what I'll talk about in a while. There's a lot of work on international guidances by international organizations. So most of this falls into four categories. You have urban resilience, you have labor productivity and protection, you have health, or you have a combination of all of these three. And I'll do another slide on that one. And then at the policy level, of course, you have country level strategies and plans. You have the national climate change plans, you have the climate change and gender action plans that have been supported by the IUCN and a lot of the countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. And then more importantly, you have something called the heat wave response or heat action plans, which I will do a deep dive on. At the project level, I've done a very general categorization of infrastructure and non-infrastructure related projects on heat and gender. So infrastructure related projects are dominantly focused on urban development. So they're looking at passive cooling, they're looking at nature-based solutions, and the non-infrastructure project is more the financing aspect of it. So they're looking at disaster risk financing, they're looking at income supports, and a lot of this is enabled by international and local civil society organizations. The last one is data and information platforms. And for example, the Global Heat Health Information Network is one of the databases that I used a lot. There's also, I just wanted to point out something called the Federation of American Scientists, and they have their own extreme heat challenge, where a number of scientists from the US have come together and are proposing solutions to the federal government. So for instance, in the US, you have something called the Stafford Declaration. Now, the Stafford Declaration is if a state experiences a natural disaster, and they don't have enough money to be able to deal with it on their own, they can request the federal government to release more funds. And so these scientists are trying to advocate that extreme heat needs to be recognized as one of the disasters that goes into the Stafford Declaration. I'm going to do a little bit of a synopsis of the international guidances. So this is typically by international organizations. And as I said, they're on four key areas. And I did a keyword analysis on most of these documents to identify what kind of vulnerable population are they most interested in. So for the ones on health, so for example, you have the WHO, you have the Pan Health American organizations, all of them are taking out heat wave level guidances, and they're talking about the elderly in particular. And they focus on developing heat warning systems, strengthening the health capacity of the government, and the development of something called heat action plans that I will do a deep dive on. Secondly, a lot of advice is on urban planning and development. So the plans that look at passive cooling solutions, urban development, etc. Here, the vulnerable population is not very strongly identified. In some cases, for example, the US Environmental Protection Agency guidelines, you will find that they look at, wanting more senior centers. So they look a little bit at the elderly, but they do not have a defined vulnerable population. And so the gender sensitivity of this is quite low. The vulnerable populations that the labor protection guidelines identify, like you have the trade union guidelines, you have stuff from the ILO, they obviously focus on workers and poverty. That's their main issue. And they are focusing on increasing occupational health and safety regulations at the workplace in relation to heat. And then some of them have a combination of all of these three. So for example, the IFRC guidelines, they identify a number of the populations at risk. They identify pregnant women, the urban poor, the disabled, the elderly. And then they're also trying to look at a number of combinations of developing early warning systems, having nature-based solutions, and protecting at-risk groups. For the country level plans, I looked at a lot of plans, but I'm only going to focus on South Asia and Southeast Asia right now because the technical assistance also focuses dominantly in these two regions. And without going into a lot of detail, government level efforts are basically categorized in a number of layers. You have the climate change action plans, and then within that, you have the climate change and gender action plans. And then you have the heat action plans. That's sort of like the logic of the efforts. But not every country has what is called a heat action plan. They have something like a national cooling plan. So for example, India has both national level guidelines for heat and a national cooling plan. Cambodia doesn't have a heat level guidance. They only have a cooling plan. And when you look at gender considerations just generally over here, generally, they don't have a lot of gender considerations. I think that was expected. If they do, what they mean is they want to collect sex disaggregated data, but they keep saying they will collect gender disaggregated data. And then they have something called that's interesting in China is that they have heat subsidies for workers. So if you're employing people and you're keeping them in sort of dangerous levels of activity, let's say beyond 37 degrees Celsius, then the worker is allowed higher compensation or they're allowed leaves, etc. So they have all of these regulations. Parallelly, you have a number of organizations that are also creating heat action plans when the government, in a way, is not. So for Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, IFRC is really pushing for early action protocols. And this is their own humanitarian effort protocols, but they engage with the government in trying to create something like cash transfers for low-income group during heat waves. So in a way, like a parallel heat action planning is also existing in addition to whatever is happening at the national level government. I'm going to do a deep dive now on one of the countries. So as I was saying, a number of plans exist. So we can begin with the updated nationally determined contributions. You have the adaptation plan, you have the climate change policy, the CC gaps, and then you have the heat wave management plans. I think at a glance, it's very clear that when I did a keyword analysis based on these keywords, disability, women, elderly, poverty, etc., it's no surprise that the gender action plan has skyrocketed. It has more than 700 mentions of women. Compare that to the heat wave action plan of a province, 0 mentions. So I think one of the key messages of this slide is you have high levels plans that are committing to gender, but you don't have the same kind of analysis coming out from the bureaucratic level or at the administrative level. So there is a big divide between the two. I'm going to now do a deep dive on heat action plans. What exactly are heat action plans that I've been mentioning for the last hour or so? So in the early 2000s, there were a lot of heat waves in Europe that killed a lot of people. And so a number of countries started coming up with guidances on how at the country level they could deal with this, how they should have early warning systems, how can they protect their vulnerable population. And then the WHO in 2008 took a lot of these guidances and then came up with a heat health guidance plan. And this became the blueprint for a lot of countries in developing their heat wave or heat action plans. And it identifies 8 key things that should go into heat action planning. So you're supposed to designate a lead body to coordinate everything, the collaborative mechanisms and the emergency response. You are to implement accurate alert systems. You are to develop a heat health information system and a communication plan for involving people in that. And then you need short-term and long-term strategies for keeping the indoors cool. You also want to provide care for the vulnerable. You want to prepare your health systems and your social care systems. And then you also want to engage in some long-term urban planning and engage in real-time surveillance and evaluations. So this is basically the blueprint that a lot of countries ended up using. And I think India is a very good example of a massive policy diffusion here, because in 2013, Ahmedabad created its first heat action plan. And this was the first in South Asia in response to a heat wave that killed thousands of its people. And very quickly, this spread through India. And as of now, at least 100 of these exist at the state level or at the city level. In fact, one analysis has looked at 37 of these and presented a kind of a critical analysis. So I looked at existing heat action plans. I also looked at the existing research on heat action plans, and a number of issues arise with the documents right now. Most of them are gender blind. They do not have considerations for women or for other at-risk populations. They do not identify their coordination mechanisms very well. So a lot of times they will say things like, this is the responsibility of this, and this is the responsibility of that. But their coordination does not involve the at-risk population itself. So they will not involve the Ministry of Women. They will not involve the Ministry of Children, which is the population that's been dying the most in heat waves. They are chronically underfunded, and they have very weak legal foundations, and they are very poorly contextualized. So you will see that there's some criticism that apparently some heat action plans are sort of copying the context out of other heat action plans. A lot of heat action plans, and this is also to do with capacity, they don't have the data to be able to say, these are our heat thresholds for the city. So they're relying a lot on national level statistics that may not be true for their level of state. And a lot of the plans that do exist are not even heat action plans. They're heat wave response plans. The difference, of course, being that a heat wave response plan is like an emergency response. Oh, there's a heat wave, let us just immediately do these things right now. Versus a heat action plan, which would have a longer term vision in terms of a lot of things. They are not all created with equal expertise. You'll find a lot of heat action plans in India. They're commanding consultants from PwC, or they have resources from the Climate Change Network abroad. There's a lot of interagency coordination in some of them, like for Jodhpur or for Surat. But for example, if you look at Pakistan's plans for Karachi and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it is only the provincial disaster management units that are looking at it. So on their own, they're creating certain plans. And they don't obviously command a lot of expertise in everything. I read one of the articles that says that a lot of times heat wave response plans are also forcing the individualization of responses. Now, what does that mean? It means a lot of them come with advisory, very simplistic advisory, like you need to drink more water, access more cooling areas. Okay, but like I make $2 a day. And then if water costs 50 cents a day, how am I going to drink or like access water every single day during the heat wave? Or so it doesn't show the understanding of the, let's say, the political hemisphere of water and food and resources in the country itself. And of course, early warning systems, they exist in all of these plans, but they're not well communicated. So for example, there's a paper looking at the Ahmedabad's response on early warning systems, which says that because it utilized a lot of SMSs and online communication, a lot of women were not able to actually receive these messages. And this one is a really unfortunate one. One thing is about government capacity, of course, that doing this requires a lot of budget and training and expertise. But when I was working on a project back home in Nepal, and we were telling the government that if you just better target your solar irrigation subsidies, women may actually be able to use it. And they said, oh, but then if we write it, then we actually have to do it. what this means is, I think there is a disinterest at the policy level of why is this important? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if we do this, we need a lot more money to be able to do this. And so there's this question of how do we engage the government to see gender is really important? I think that's a very important question. This I took from one of the resources online where, again, the PDMA is the organization that facilitated the Karachi and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa plans in Pakistan. But then this deputy commissioner in Karachi says that there is no defined role of the PDMA. So I'm doing everything on my own. And there's an advisory, so they will release an advisory for a heat wave, but I'm the one who has to do everything and I don't have the resources to do it. I think looking at India, because again, India has a number of these heat action plans. And if I look at, so what I did was I just created like a 4-point scale of how well they focused on all of these mechanisms that the WHO identifies as important. And I also added the gender responsiveness element of if they do a vulnerability analysis, if they understand intersectional realities, etc. Most of them have an agreement on a lead body, they have timely alert systems, but some of them have actual vulnerability analysis and understand intersectional realities better, like the ones in Jodhpur and Surat. And the reason for this is because Jodhpur worked with this organization called Mahila Housing Trust from the very beginning. So they had engaged like a women's level organization when they were creating the heat action plan. That being said, of course, a lot of HAPs in India have been criticized for not engaging in vulnerability assessments and lacking funding. Now, moving on to the final part of the presentation, where I'm going to talk about recommendations for the ADB. I've been going on and on about heat action plans a lot. And why are these important? These are important because at the city level or at the country level, this is a defined legal measure for you to be able to respond long-term to a heat wave. And you can ensure with this mechanism that no one is really actually left behind. And so if you have certain principles for engendering these heat action plans, then you would do a better job at each phase of actually reaching the vulnerable. The very beginning is acknowledging that socioeconomic realities and cultural norms marginalize some more than others. I think once you have this idea in mind and then you look at every step of heat action planning, you will be able to understand how to gender each approach. And you want to take a whole systems approach, which means that a lot of policies that I've looked at will have a gender section as a separate section. You know, it's a separate chapter. It's not really integrated into like the core activities, but taking a systems approach means you are looking at every question and asking, where are the people here and how do I reach them? You need data, obviously, to be able to map vulnerabilities. So this comes from a vulnerability analysis. And you need to ensure that your communication is accessible, that your actions are accessible, and they do not exacerbate vulnerability. I'll talk about an example later. And very importantly, as I said, there are a lot of commitments at the international and national level that the country has signed on to. But the heat wave action plan is not coming under these commitments. It's almost like a separate administrative document. And of course, this needs to be followed by M&E, the learning of the lessons in consultations with groups. So you can look at all of these steps at phase-wise steps. So the first phase will obviously be the preparation and the design. This would indulge coordination and collaborating with ministries and departments related to women and other at-risk groups. You want to do a vulnerability analysis. And what does a vulnerability analysis in a heat action plan actually look like? I think Surat has a pretty good example of this. So I think, again, a lot of people working in climate change are very aware of the IPCC vulnerability assessment frameworks. So it looks at exposure to the hazard, it looks at sensitivity, and it looks at adaptive capabilities. And all of that can be broken down into a number of contextualized things. For example, the Surat HAP looks at, if you have housing, then who is the owner? What kind of rooms do you have? What is the material of the housing? Are your roofs, what is the color of your roofs? For cooking arrangement, it looks at what is the type of fuel that's being used, what's the cooking area. It looks at sanitation, it looks at electricity and health. And in health, it also looks at the differential impact of heat on men and women because they do not physiologically respond to it in the same way. So women were, after the Surat exercise, found that they were more prone to heat stroke or heat rashes compared to men. So what does that mean in terms of the access of healthcare that they need and awareness of heat support? Do they know where to go once something happens, or do they have access to that? Of course, it may not be perfect, but this is just an idea of how it could be done. And there are other mechanisms. A lot of them are pretty self-explanatory, but for example, financing mechanisms is something I'll talk about later. And then there's something called a teach the teachers thing that I found in the Vienna Action Plan. So they look at teachers and students as multipliers of information. So if the ministry does a heat workshop with the teachers, teaching them very basic things of like what to do during a heat wave, how to protect children, etc., the teachers are going to teach that to the students. Then the students are going to talk about that with their parents. So it's kind of like a multiplier, a very simple multiplier effect that the Vienna Action Plan talks about. In terms of implementation, again, these are fairly basic things, but a few things I want to highlight is when we talk about communicating with at-risk groups, we all know that digital media is not the best way to go. A lot of them obviously don't have access to these technologies. So the default to do for ministries or departments is they engage in volunteerism, right? So they will hire a lot of volunteers to have this information disseminated to people, etc. But there's a lot of research coming out now that shows that this volunteerism builds on the unpaid care work of women. So it means that you expect them to, you already understand that they are more vulnerable after disasters, and then you're employing the same workforce as unpaid workers to give out information and communications regarding this plan. So at the most basic level, pay them. There are other interesting things as well. For example, you could have hotlines for helping the isolated and the elderly, and then you have for those impacted by violence. A number of these are already in their climate change plans. These are not something entirely new. I've just taken aspects that they've already identified and integrated it into the heat action planning. And in terms of evaluation, you want to explore longer term plans, for example, nature-based solutions and passive cooling options. You want to continue income support for lower households. Like, for example, in the US, there's something called the Lower Group Income Support community-based grant. So they give you money to be able to buy fans and coolers, to be able to afford that. And of course, you need to explore more traditional knowledge of coping with heat as well. I'm going to talk about a few more solutions on heat that I came across. And this is more in relation to the urban development side. So there's a lot of work, as I was saying, on cooling cities. There's a lot of methods that are usually talked about. One of the most common is cool roofs or using solar reflective roofs that have been used very widely in a lot of countries in Asia right now. You have green roofs, so you're planting a lot of trees. You have permeable pavements, so you're changing the quality and the structure and the stuff that you're using to create the pavements itself. You have forestry programs, etc. But I thought the way to do this is to look at the governance angle of it and not just say, oh, why does this country not do this? That decision can be left to the country, but what we can say is if you look at a number of things, you will be able to decide what aspect is best for you. So I took this from the Georgetown Climate Center approach that looks at all of these methods, but then it also advises on looking at if the method actually reduces heat for the area. How economic is it? So how much money does the government have to spend for this? How much is the public health supported by this? How much is the environmental consequence of this? How much is the legal burden of this? Like, do you have to mandate people to do it? Can you create building codes to do it? And what's the administrative level of burden for this? So all of this is great, but then I thought we could also add a simple gender considerations aspect. And the key words here, when you're looking at the solutions would be, how is it going to help women or other at-risk populations? How affordable is it going to be? So let's say you have these cool roofs, but is the upkeep, affordable for them? What area is this going to be created in? As we all know, more lush green parks are in the richer areas, and usually poorer areas are devoid of all of these things. So if you create a park, where is it going to be? So once you have all of these questions in mind, I think picking the right passive cooling solution is going to be a lot easier. This is one of the examples of the Mahila Housing Trust in Ahmedabad, where they've facilitated very simple things, like not just cool roofs, but this one is basically resin-coated bamboo. So they've like pieced together all of these bamboo mats, and they reduce indoor temperatures by 3 to 5%. So again, a very affordable and clean technology. Now, going on to another project where a lot of interest is there globally, financing gender responsive mechanisms to heat. There's a lot of work now on parametric insurances. You have disaster risk financing. I've taken this from the R-Struck disaster risk financing for heat, and it's a very simple framework where in 12 steps, you try and understand how to finance this mechanism. So the first question you're beginning with is, who do you want to help? What are the kind of responses you're looking to finance? And what are the activities that could be part of this response? All of that is there, but I want to focus on the types of disaster risk financing mechanisms that are available for this. So for example, you will have 3 things that they identify. For heat, you could have reserved funds from the government, which means you have like a budget line that already says that you have so and so amount of money every year. You could have contingent credit. So you have, collaborations with development bank like ours that have contingent credits that they release annually. Or you could have insurances and parametric insurances, which is a third party comes in, for example, the R-Struck Foundation that's working with SEVA right now in India, who takes up the responsibility of financing for a certain group of people, a certain amount of wage when a threshold of heat is crossed. So when they cannot go to work, this insurance will cover their wages. Just ending this with a number of potential partners that we might be interested to work with at the ADB. Again, there are a lot of them, but just to highlight a few, I think the Aga Khan Foundation and John Hopkins are doing a lot of research on extreme hate in Pakistan, and actually this has already been identified by our project as well. The IFRC, like I said, is creating a lot of heat action plans and heat response plans in the countries that the TA is working in. So they would be an interesting partner to work with. And of course, you can't miss out country level stakeholders, including women's groups in these countries. So a better scoping of that would really help us as well. And I think one advocacy partner we might be interested in exploring for worker protections is actually trade unions. I don't know if the ADB has worked with trade unions before. Maybe it's antithetical to say that the workers, that we should be working with trade unions. But because, of course, when we're talking about workers and we're talking about pushing for worker rights and worker level occupational heat standards, trade unions can really come in because they've already been doing a lot of work in Europe in particular in pushing for these regulations for heat at the national level. Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you so much for having been here. I hope this was worth your time. And I just want to say 2 things. One, you all have been working on this a lot more longer than I have. So if there are any mistakes I've made, please let me know. The second thing, I really want to thank my team, my supervisors, Zanibal and Jinha, Mar, Nathan, and everybody. You've been great. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And now time for questions. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was such an impressive presentation, and the fact that you could recite it without looking at anything, I'm so impressed. And, like the granular recommendations, both on the action plans, the financing mechanism, and the partners were really great as well. Just a couple of things. One, if I may, one on a conceptual level, I wonder, do we have, let me rephrase it. I think the the statistics behind whether or not women as a group are disproportionately impacted is not clear. And the reason why I'm saying is, there are direct impacts, there are indirect impacts, there are secondary impacts. Direct impacts are how many people die of natural disaster. Like, so for instance, a lot of people quote the statistics, 14 times more likely to die of. But actually, there was a 2013 paper in Global Environmental Change by Seema Arora Johnson, which is very widely sort of downloaded.
And she actually looked into that statistics. Where did it come from? It originally came from a paper by Neumeyer, and they sort of did the calculations in a certain way. And then she found out that, actually it was just a back of envelope calculation that has been used and abused so much that it's become like a zombie statistics, which, I don't know how helpful it is. So why don't we talk about differential impacts as opposed to disproportionate impacts? That's one. And secondly, you have that question about labor productivity, for instance, right? I wonder, the implications of heat waves on labor productivity and eventually on GDP. To what extent does it actually take into account, women's work, like the informal work that is not counted, the care work that is not counted? So if those were counted, would the implications, the eventual economic implications, be a lot larger? And does that in turn have some, facts and evidence that can be used to guide the discussions about the need to focus on labor issues a lot more? So that was more a conceptual question. The second, on the practical side, I wonder, the heat action plans, are they embedded as part of existing systems like the social protection systems in countries? The question on trade unions, that's a really good point, but most of these trade unions are not very representative, especially of women and informal workers. So those were some reflections, but thank you so much. It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you. On the first point, I have to say, Zonibal did flag this thing, but I thought that was not the same paper, and I found it in a different statistic guide. So like I was saying, I found it in the IUCN Disaster and Gender Statistic Guide. And you know what? They didn't mention the source, so I'm going to take it up with them. But yeah, so she had told me that there's actually contestation about this thing. But I think the larger picture that I was trying to draw is that it's not just that one research. It's a lot of other things that are also disproportionately impacting women. But I do agree that, for example, on your second point that you were saying, to what extent do these labor productivity researches, do they take into account women's labor? I don't think they do. So they're really only looking at the formal economy. And this is also part of one of the disproportionate impacts, like I was saying. So because the informal economy is not accounted for, there are studies, however, that look at only in women and on heat and the relationship of how much productivity they're losing. So for example, I think there is this paper that looks at heat in South Asia and informal economy, and it shows that women are losing up to 30% every year in terms of labor productivity. But I do think like a marriage between the studies, like you're suggesting, is important. The third thing on, I absolutely agree that even though you said that, of course, like working with trade unions is interesting, a lot of them are not representative of the actual labor force. So maybe the idea is not to engage with them, but would engage with a number of kinds of worker associations in the country. So you're not just working with the trade unions, you're working with the women's worker associations. Seva in India is extremely famous that everybody is kind of working with, of course. So I'm sure like these kind of organizations exist in Pakistan or in Bangladesh. And I have to say there is a disproportionate number of researchers on India. So I think it's a good thing that this TA is focusing not on India and on other countries in South Asia. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to address your question about the disproportionate impact on women, because I think Labisha mentioned that we had actually had a discussion about this Neumeyer paper that has been questioned, and rightfully so. But I think that there's still other data that shows the impact that the differential impact that disasters have on women and men. So that's fine. But I think when it comes to heat, we actually have sufficient evidence that shows that women are actually disproportionately impacted by heat stress. So for example, even if you look at where data exists, so Europe actually keeps a lot of mortality related data. 56% more women died during the heat wave in 2022 than men. So, that's just looking at mortality data. We also have to look into account sort of all of the other aspects that she mentioned, I think, in her third slide, which is really related to how women's health is impacted, how it impacts care work, how it impacts the work that women do. And if we're looking at how most informal workers, those women who work as sort of carrying bricks in India, the majority of those people that are doing that really, really hard work are women, then, you know, whose income is actually decreasing because they get paid by the number of bricks that they have to carry. And when it's 40 degrees outside, you just can't carry as many bricks as quickly as you can, as you would otherwise. So I think there's all these sort of multiplying factors that contribute to that disproportionate impact. So the idea behind RTA is really to show how those disproportionate impacts manifest themselves. So I think just it's not about just the disaster data. It is about sort of the daily lives of women and how they're disproportionately impacted by extreme heat.
Yes.
After Miss Alice James. Thank you for that very wonderful and very interesting presentation. And it's so well researched. And yeah, there's a lot of new information that I got today. But I was just thinking, because it seems that we are, and a lot of our TAs are advocating for countries and governments to come up with heat action plans. I was just thinking from a practical point of view, many of our governments, especially in Central Asia, they haven't even come up with a climate change action plan. And some with the climate change action plan, some have not even been implementing it properly. So I was just thinking, instead of, well, in addition to advocating for heat action plans for countries to develop them, how about maybe for countries that haven't even had climate change action plans to integrate heat into their climate change action plans? Because at some point, anyway, heat stress is at the other end of the continuum. A lot of our, or many of our climate change action plans focus on floods and this, and yeah, rising sea levels and that. So the other end of that spectrum would be the heat stress. So from a practical point of view, perhaps one of the things we could look at is to see how governments can integrate heat stress into their current climate action plans. And of course, at the same time, we should keep on advocating that gender be, you know, systematically embedded into these action plans, whether for floods, whether for heat or something. I mean, it's just a thought that I came across with while you were doing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to respond to that, I think that's a really great suggestion. And I think, I suppose for South Asia, dominantly, a lot of the countries already have these plans. So my bias went towards, in a way, also saying that why don't we have the haves, because we already have a lot of this. But you're absolutely right. For example, one of the countries in the TA is Tajikistan. And Tajikistan doesn't have this framework, but the German Red Cross is working on an early action protocol on heat and cold waves over there. So I think there is already some level of civil society effort where they're working with the government, but you're absolutely right. Maybe they should start at the beginning right now with integrating it into the climate change plan first. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, Labisha. I've seen you working very hard in the last couple of months, and clearly you haven't been just watching TikTok videos. This is so comprehensive and really just a very impressive piece of work. So thank you for your hard work. I wanted to build on a little bit of what Alice was saying. I mean, it's really just questioning the focus on action plans. I mean, not the focus only, but just maybe a bit of reflection on the flimsiness of action plans. And I liked the story that you're telling from the deputy commissioner in Pakistan who said, it's me that's implementing this. I mean, we in the kind of violence against women world, there's been a lot of focus over the last couple of decades on getting national violence against women action plans or ending violence against women action plans. But like out of, 90% of the countries in Asia that have them, I don't think any of them are properly funded, and they're not institutionalized, right? So they're sort of vaguely with the Ministry of Women's Affairs or some, and then there's some kind of coordination mechanism that might be, a meeting every 6 months where a few ministries get together and they talk. But, the effort that was put into creating and, sort of endorsing these documents still falls short because, none of it is actually being implemented. And it's part of, so like, how do we think differently about the advocacy and the positioning that ADB can do and have with the Ministry of Finance? Like, how do we get like real institutional and real financing of actions? Not to say we shouldn't focus on heat action plans or integrated climate change action plans that include heat, but I think we need to do more strategic thinking around financing.
I think that's a really pertinent point. And this is a question I had for my interviewees as well. Okay, so we have all of these plans, but are they actually really ever implemented? And I think one of my respondents said, well, we have to start somewhere, I suppose, But so it's just, I guess the heat action plan is a starting point for showing the seriousness of the government as well, that they've taken this seriously, they've understood the data behind it, and are prepared to expend themselves in it. I absolutely agree that just because you have a plan, it doesn't mean that it's actually going to translate into something lovely and wonderful. I think just Nepal has a lot of these, and like I've always been extremely frustrated with the level of their inability to actually do this. But on the financing mechanisms, I completely agree. We need to look at different ways to be able to finance this. And I guess one of the ways is the disaster risk financing mechanisms that I'd also talked about. So you have these parametric insurance companies that, for example, there's something called Ibiza, which is a parametric insurance company. It's funding farmers, dairy farmers in India right now, during extreme heat waves. So when they cannot go and sell their produce or when their livestock is impacted, they set out at a certain threshold, they are going to give the wages or like give insurances to these farmers. So I suppose, of course, exploring mechanisms with the Ministry of Finance is also important, but you have other sort of private sector also trying to come in and work with the government. So those could be interesting aspects to look into. Yeah. Oh, okay. Right. For advocacy, there's something called chief heat officers as well. This is the Ashrock Foundation has really pushed for in a number of countries, like Bangladesh has a chief heat officer. I think it really works to spotlight the work of the importance of heat work and the work that they are doing in relation to heat. I think, however, one of the interviews was reflecting on how, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of power, but they're great for raising awareness, particularly at the community level. So there are these other minor mechanisms as well. Yes. Is it online?
No, it's congratulations. It says congratulations.
Okay. Thank you. That one is also congratulations. All right. Oh, great, great.
From Claire.
All right, I guess we're at the end of it. All right, great. Thank you so much.
So I just want to thank Labisha for not watching too many TikTok videos. And she doesn't have TikTok. And yeah, for working with us over the last 2 months. It's been great having her and her inquisitive mind. As you can see, she did a lot of really great work in looking at this issue. And we think now we have converted you over to the gender and heat stress world. Oh, there's one question. Okay. All right.
Mechanisms may also be a consideration for financing action. Yes, the answer is yes. Okay. Sorry, just there was a question on how forecast-based mechanisms may also be a consideration for financing action plan. Absolutely. This is part of the parametric heat insurances that I was talking about as well. And just going back, the German Red Cross is already trying to do this in Tajikistan. So yes, great point. Yeah.
So as you can see, the work that she has done will really serve us well as we move forward in implementing RTA. And we look forward to continuing to work with her. So Thank you very much for all your hard work. And now we have some coffee and snacks at the back. So for those of you in the room, please join us for a bit of merienda. So thank you very much. And we'll see you again at our next event. So.
Congratulations.
Let me help you.
Yes.